Well, hello, AP Bio, and this is our first week, an intro lesson. During these 2 weeks for remote learning, I'm going to try for about a week and a half of that, to flip the classroom in the sense where you will listen to the lecture. That way you have the slides and the images and the words and the questions, and then the very next day, it might span for 2 days, we'll have Q&A about your book reading, concept checks, and then of course the lecture. I want you to treat these slides, these videos, as though you were actually in class. I know that's a little bit hard to ramp up after all that's happened of what it's like to be in class, but treat it as though you were in class. Take good notes. You will get points for note checks, participation, all of that. And so this will be our first week to the content of AP Bio, since we've already probably discussed the nature of the class, what to expect, how it works, and what I'm like. This will be your first introduction to the kind of the foundations of biology. So we're going to do this in 2 parts, and I won't speak too long. It'll be about 20 minutes. And take good notes and be prepared for me to call on you the next day with some of the questions that come up in this talk. So go ahead and put today's date. We'll be in chapter 1 in your book. There's your title, and you're going to get a real good feel for how closely I stick to the textbook and help you navigate through that large bit of info. So the first thing you'll see in chapter 1 is this cute little mouse. He's kind of sandy brown and white. But what they want to bring up is this mouse and this mouse are both of the exact same quote-unquote species. Now, I say quote-unquote because the word species, as you'll find out later in the year, is a real problematic concept. It kind of works for practical value, but life doesn't really seem to fit that box very well. Life seems to move in terms of more of a series rather than a species, much like you know about your iPhones. Or whatever phone you have different versions that come out every year, but it's still kind of the same type of phone. So anyway, we'll talk about that later, but this was a study done between these two versions of a mouse in Florida, and one lived further inland and one was on the beach. And if you're just looking at these, you'll notice that one is light and one is darker, but I want you to take a look at the darker version there, the darker variety. Notice that he's not brown all the way around. He's that kind of a dark brown, that grassy brown, only where? On the top, right? So underneath, he's white as can be, which means there's something about his coloration that is affecting his view, how he's seen from up above. Okay, so you can see where this is going in terms of predation on these mice. And so this is an example of the small, inductive, tiny things that a biologist would want to study. And we will probably talk through this in class on our online thing for Q&A. But they basically looked at how often these mice were picked up by predators. If you put a dark mouse on a light background and a light mouse on a light background, that'd be the control for the light one. Then you go to the dark environment, you put the dark mouse on that one and the light mouse on that one, and that would be the other version. And notice they're using the word camouflage. And what they want to start figuring out is, how does a concept, an adaptation, a phenomenon like camouflage, how does that actually work in the wild? So we get some numbers. That's the first thing you got to do. And so far so good. It seems to be obvious how it works. And then it gets a little more complicated. Then they go ahead and do the light and dark model mice on the different environments, but they do it during full moon, no moon on light and dark colored soil. Now let your brain look at this graph for a while, and you're going to see some weird stuff. So on light colored sandy soil during a full moon, notice it doesn't really matter if you are a light mouse or a dark mouse. Look how close those bars are. But then you go on a light colored soil and there's no moon whatsoever, and the dark mice are picked up way more frequently by a predator. So we would want to start asking, what is happening here on a light-colored soil with no moon? What is it about a bright light source like a full moon that causes these mice to be caught less, especially the brown ones? So now the white mice, they get picked up a little bit more. The brown ones go way down. And then the white and the dark are both picked up about the same on a full moon. What is happening there? And then you go to the dark colored soil, and on a full moon, right? Good light source on dark colored soil, the dark mice aren't picked up that much. Whereas there's no moon, not a bright light source, they're picked up more. And then, of course, if you're a white mouse on dark colored soil, period, you're toast. So we would want to come up with some statements about how camouflage works. So what I'd like for you to do right now in your notes, take just a minute max, or you can do this afterwards. I want you to make a hypothesis or write a concept statement, a summary. Take a shot at how does camouflage work based on this slide right here. Okay, so you want to do that as soon as you're done with this video. How does camouflage work based on the data of this slide? That'll feel a little weird, a little hard to answer at first. Let your brain work on it, but see if you can come up with a statement. So the core of this class is basically an organism's ability to coordinate, to correlate its life with its environment. How does the environment and the organism, how do they work together? We don't study life apart from an environment, and we're not just studying the environment. And we can't just study life in the abstract. We learn about life by studying actual living things. You can't say, I don't think life is like, if you're not pulling that information from actual living things. And so this is what it feels like to do biology at this level, is that we have got to look at data, we've got to try out a few scenarios and see what we can say, not what we want to say. What is life actually doing? And at the core of this is the concept of evolution. This class is organizing principle as evolution, and it starts on day one and ends on the last day. And so this is a concept at the AP level, which gets a lot more sophisticated than you might have experienced in my freshman bio class, and something that we are really going to have to unpack and wrestle with and define a lot more specifically. But as of right now, from ninth grade, it's the process of unfolding, not just change, but unfolding, that has transformed life on Earth. And unfolding means increased biodiversity and increased biogeography. So we'll come back to that later. So the first section in your book talks about how biologists study the diversity of life. And so there is an attempt in this science to make sense of all the information and all the concepts and all the phenomena that ties life on this planet together. And so in your book, at the beginning of the book and throughout, there's always these four big ideas. I strongly encourage you, yea, warn you, to commit these to memory, write them down in your notes, make a big deal out of it, highlight it, and walk through each one of these. These are, besides the organizing principle of evolution, these are the four big ideas of the entire year. This is a major issue, and I will test you on this. I'll ask you about this. We'll talk about these, and we'll unpack them. But these four big ideas are with us for the next 9-10 months. So get to know them very well. So life, it can be studied and seems to be organized at successive levels. There's an important point that I want to make here, and I'm going to give you an article online to read that we can talk about related to this. Life can be studied at different levels because it seems to be organized at different levels, and we break those down. We label them, we divide them, and I want you to know it's kind of a false division. Life is just one phenomena, but in a practice called reductionism, very complex systems are divided up and reduced into simpler components, and notice what I've got underlined here, only to make them more manageable to study. This is just for the sake of study. Is life really that simple? No. The article I'm going to give you is called The Secret of Life. But to study it, we have to divide it up and break it up so that our brains can get a handle on it. So I want to be careful. The science is reductionistic in a way, but the actual phenomena of life is not. So please keep that in mind. So here are the levels that you see in your book, all put together. So we will start at the most basic level in this class, not at atoms, but at molecules, and not just molecules, but specifically biological molecules. And then we can take those up into the next level of organization. We can put those together to make types of tiny structures called organelles. We can put those inside of a cell, which is the basic unit of life. That is where life actually starts, at that level. And you put cells together, you get special types of tissue, be they plant tissue or liver or nervous tissue or anything like that. But you can take those tissues and arrange them in certain shapes and get special systems like a solar panel called a leaf, or a heart, or a lung. You put enough of those organs together and you can have an entire organism that's comprised of a number of different systems. And this is another level of complexity. You put a number of those individuals together, then you get a population of those types of things, trees here in this case. You put different populations, different groups of organisms together, and you'll get a community where they interact with each other. And you place those into a weather pattern, basically, in a geographic spot, and you have an ecosystem. And once you put all those ecosystems together on a sphere, you get the planet. So that's how that works really, really simply. And you can study life at each one of those levels, but please understand, it's all one thing all at once. We just divide it up in the science. So speaking of the science, this is from 9th grade. Biology comes from bios and logos, and it means life, and logos is like the logic, the study, the word, the knowledge of. And so basically this class is the word of life, the study of life, the knowledge of life. And this is the only place that we have this phenomenon to study. So Earth is the best and worst place to study it because it's the only place. All year long, we basically ask two questions of every organism we come in contact with. Why does this living thing have these very particular features? Why are they there? How did they get there? And basically, how do they work, right? So it's kind of like, what do you have and how does it work? And it's the same if you go out into the field. You find some creature, you're like, what are you and why are you here? How did you get here? So these are some of the basic questions that we ask all year. Now, on the surface, that may seem not very intellectual or complicated, but I could tell you exactly, if we want to talk about something weird, we talk about, and you'll read it in the article, your own mitochondria. No, don't say they're the powerhouse of the cell, but they do make ATP, the only fuel that you run on. The mitochondria that make life possible, that are in your cells, they actually have their own DNA, different from your DNA. It's as though they were a different organism. How did that get there? What are they doing there? Right? So we have some really strange questions to ask. Another thing that happens in biology is a thing called emergent properties. So an emergent property is something that results from the arrangement of certain things, but is not something that could be predicted. Right? It's a new level that would not have been logical or obvious at the outset. So an example of this is if you have a hole in the top where you put a dome and you have these two arches, you get this funny triangle right in that spot, that little shape. Anywhere you put an arch and an arch together, you're going to get a triangle. Now the triangle is not the goal, but it does form and it is there and it's real, but it's because of the arrangement of other parts. So this is a simple example in architecture, how you get another shape, another form of order, but that was unintended in a way, but it's not chaos and it's not random. It always happens. So what that means is in biology is that form determines function. At every level of a hierarchy, we want to look at the form, the physical structure of something, be it a molecule or a feather, and that will help us understand how it works. So hummingbird, their anatomy teaches us how they can hover and beat their wings so fast. Basically, their entire wing is the hand. It's elongated. Biologists also study the interactions of life. Living things do not exist in isolation. And so really the cool point here is, what does that mean for humans? We tend to think that we're outside of nature or above nature. And what we're finding out very much right now is that we are deeply embedded in nature and we are a part of this system and we are a part of that interaction. So what does that mean? I think it could alter the way we live, and it already is, as a matter of fact, kind of in a negative way. In a more positive sense, there are leafcutter ants that cut off leaves and farm them to grow fungus. There's acacia tree ants that the tree provides them with sugar packets and it protects them. Biologists, as I mentioned earlier, study the diversity of life. Life doesn't have to be the way it is. It could just be all E. coli, all bacteria. But life seems to have an inherent principle in it that wants to diversify, wants to increase varieties of its own kind. And that is really something, it's tied to evolution, but really something that I want you to focus on. It's not that we are trying to oppose the idea of variation or variation is somehow unnatural. Variation seems to be built into the system. And so that could mean a lot for certain people who have antagonism or negative questions about, say, evolution. But also for all of us, that means what is life actually? What is it capable of? What kind of powers does it have? And why does it do this? You think it would be easier to just stay the same, but it continues to vary. I don't know if you remember from middle school or early high school what the characteristics of living things are. Any list that we get will be completely unsatisfying, but this is the standard list. They have structure and they develop, they have offspring and they adjust. But even if you look at this, there's some things missing, like comprised of cells, possess DNA, So really, this is a springboard and a starting point for us to talk about what life is and what it's capable of and what does it actually do. Here are some questions that I'd like to talk to you about during our Q&A time. I would like you to return to this. You can pause it later and write these down in your notes. Be prepared to talk to me about these if I call on you. And I want to use this as a way to get our brains warmed up and to get our minds around what we're doing in this class. So these are questions that I want to talk about tomorrow. So I'm going to move through some basic units that you can just listen. I'm just going to remind you, we come back to all of this. So this is like a Mach 5 version of the book. So just relax and let me just throw some words at you and remind you. So one of the first things we'll study is cell anatomy, and there are two types, right? Prokaryotes like bacteria and eukaryotes, complex cells. You are eukaryotic, and they have all those organelles that we'll work hard again to memorize and to study. Life possesses this code called DNA that you remember, and most of the genetic material is in there. We'll talk about epigenetics later, but this is where in 9th grade maybe you got to do the mitosis dance, and we talked about cell division. You put different strands of DNA together and you get a new creature. So you're all the product, a hybrid of your two parents. So that's fun to talk about inheritance and genetics and how it fits with the history of life. We get into biochem. We can talk about DNA as a double helix running anti-parallel made up of 4 nucleotides, A, T, C, and G. And it's got this twisted ladder approach. DNA provides the control mechanism, the blueprint, which can be edited, but the blueprint for expression. In other words, actually making physical flesh in a creature requires information, and that's one of the strangest enigmas in life and in biology is the possession of information. It's a really cool study that we'll get into. Life requires energy and matter, so this will be our ecology stuff that we do, and energy flows through and matter is recycled within. And so plants are the organisms that kind of bridge the gap between the inorganic and the organic, and they get an entire ecosystem going. They are the producers, the autotrophs, the starters. These things are amazing in the sense that they can take radiation and make sugar out of inorganic materials and, like I said, sunlight, UV radiation. And so without plants, nothing would be possible. We'll study the interactions of life and the physical factors that affect their body types, their phenotypes. And something that I want you to note in your notes right there is by Brogdon philosophy. Most of life on this planet is built on cooperation, not competition. I know that seems really strange to modern sensibilities, but life succeeds on this planet through forming partnerships, symbiosis, mutualism, not head to head competition. It's really rare, actually. Lastly, coming to the pause for today as we talk about evolution as the core theme of this class. I have some reservations about what your book says. Does evolution make sense of everything we know about living organisms? I don't think that's true. That's why you're going to read this article called The Secret of Life. But evolution does explain both the unity and the diversity of all living things, that they have similar traits. There seems to be this type of descent where they move through time together as like a family and they diverge. The differences are due to variation built in the system, and so that's fun to talk about. So I don't think evolution answers everything, just answers some very core ideas about life's history. So when we get there, we'll talk about Luca, the last universal common ancestor, and have fun trying to figure out the secret history of life and the ancient history and what has actually transpired on this planet. Very big and cool story. So, all that said, we will take a pause right here. Evolution also needs to deal with the unity that underlies all of life and the fact that everything has the same genetic language. So, gang, there's your first little intro lecture, full of mystery, full of complexity, and full of a lot of fun. I'll see you for part 2.